It was said about the poet Rainer Maria Rilke that he had a horror of anything confined, a horror of anything confined. Well, this is, I think, to feel as if everything is closing in on you and hopelessly to feel that there's no way out, that no escape is possible. Says Rilke, it feels as though I make my own way through massive rock, like a vein of ore, alone and cased. Feeling so confined, Rilke has lost all perspective. As he writes, I am so deep inside it, so deep inside, I can't see the path or any distance. Everything is close, and everything closing in on me has turned to stone. So he feels buried by some great weight, and he calls this experience of his this terrible darkness. And yet, amazingly, while seemingly feeling hopelessly smothered, another feeling arises. Perhaps against all odds, against all hope, there surfaces a yearning, a longing for transcendence. Well, this is a yearning deep and strong for a higher or deeper dimension beyond the limits of his mind. The poet senses that from some realm beyond his mind, a mysterious force, call it God, the absolute, or the ultimate, is reaching down to spring him free. And so he prays, and interestingly, he does this in personal terms. He's not, in other words, praying to some vague impersonal force, but rather has a perception of the divine as personal. If it's you, he writes, if it's you, press down hard on me, break in that I may know the weight of your hand and the fullness of my cry. Like the weight of your hand is no weight at all, is what he's saying and experiencing. So he's experiencing the divine not as any kind of oppressive weight that should be cast off, but as a power to embrace. He wants more of this power, this divine power, not less. He therefore is not losing his religion, he's actually finding it. So a surge of hope is arising that God is reaching into his enclosure to lift him up into a domain of unlimited space and unlimited freedom. Well, it's plain that Rilke understands that it's not religion, but everything else, that is the world, perhaps his own ego, his troubles of whatever kind. It's these things that are closing in on him. What he's searching for while in this deep pain is not the peace that the world can give, which is, as Jesus said, no peace at all, but that peace that comes from an encounter with that one who's reaching down to save him. Well, in my own experience, I was 20 years old when I woke with a start from a nightmare, trembling with fear. I dreamed I was lying on a board without arms or legs. A harsh, mocking voice whispered, I have you. Like, I was terrified. Talk about feeling hopeless, trapped, closed in. Everything closing in on you, I have you. It was my experience, like Rilke's, of feeling entirely closed in without hope. Well, that nightmare was a revelation of the state I was in. The message was, this is how your life is. This is the quality of your life, Al McGee. You're in a state of confinement because you've not yet really opened your heart and soul to God, to the ultimate. That perception of a deep lack at that time never has left me. I'm so aware of that. It was a painfully revealing glimpse into the quality of my life at that time, which was a life pathetically to some degree because it was so totally dependent on a game, shooting hoops, the game of basketball. So now, because of the dream, thinking as a trunk, well, how would I find meaning? What meaning is there if life has only a one dimension to it, like the physical dimension alone, and that there are no other dimensions in which we exist? Well, if I couldn't score hoops in my terms at the time, oh, well, what would keep me going? I had the distinct feeling then that if life has a point, I surely was missing it. Well, because of that nightmare, because of the sense that I too, like Rilke, was being reached out to from another world, another dimension, the focus of my life began to change. I became vitally and urgently concerned to ground my life in a spiritual dimension. I started going to church. I was never going to go to church again. I'd stopped when I was 16. Here I was going to church. I began to pray, and I started to read the books of C.S. Lewis, and began in particular with his masterpiece, The Great Divorce. And I felt like I was beginning to come out of the state I had been in. I was beginning to break free. Well, Rilke, in his Letters to a Young Poet, wrote that it's possible to break out of whatever weight you feel is closing in upon you. We can, he wrote, deepen our sense of the divine through what he calls the practice of solitude. It's through solitude that he says that you can enter that other dimension, like the kingdom of God, which is there as a sacred space of unlimited immensity. Only one thing is necessary, he advised, and that is solitude, the immense inward solitude, to withdraw into oneself and not to meet anyone for hours. It's to go on the inward journey. Rilke is affirming that there can be in our lives a vital connection with that one anterior to the mind and senses, who can be experienced as a liberating force, regardless of how great the pressure may be upon you. It's possible through an encounter with the divine to experience what Rilke calls an indestructible intimacy. As he puts it, put out my eyes, I can see thee. Stop up my ears, I can hear thee. And without feet, I can go to thee. And without a mouth, I can still call upon thee. Tear off my arms, and I shall yet seize thee, can't even say it, seize thee with my heart as with a hand. Stop my heart, like do that to me, my brain will go on beating. And if thou settest fire to my brain, I shall still bear thee in my blood. Well, that indestructible intimacy is this heightened state of consciousness. And to be in it, he says, there is a tremendous solitude. In it, he says, how freely one breathes. And to, he adds, how clearly one thinks. For in that transcendent realm of space and freedom is what he calls the silent peak of true cognition. The silent peak of true cognition. That is, in other words, such a contemplative state is the highest reach of human intelligence. And so Rilke is encouraging his readers to plumb the depths of the furthest possible reach of the heart. Well, this is the inner journey that Father Henri Lissot called the ascent into the depths of the heart, the ascent into the depths of the heart, which is to experience the unbounded spaciousness of the heart, is to experience a sense of intimacy there with the energy of light and love that actually is the deepest ground of your own being and the deepest ground of all of life. There therefore is a way out of the horror of confinement. It's to respond to that hand that reaches down to raise you up from the darkness of confinement. Therefore, I thank God for my own self-revealing nightmare.